One of Hegel's big ideas is that creatures with a self-conception are the subjects of developmental processes that exhibit a distinctive structure. We could call a creature essentially self-conscious if what it is for itself, its self-conception, is an essential element of what it is in itself. How something that's essentially self-conscious appears to itself is part of what it really is. Essentially self-conscious creatures are partially self-constituting creatures. Their self-regarding attitudes are efficacious in a distinctive way. For such a being can change what it is in itself by changing what it is for itself. To say of an essentially self-conscious being that what it is for itself is an essential element of what it is in itself entails that an alteration in self-conception carries with it an alteration in the self of which it is a conception. Essentially self-conscious creatures accordingly enjoy the possibility of a distinctive kind of self-transformation, making themselves be different by taking themselves to be different. Because what they are in themselves is at any point the outcome of such a developmental process, depending on their attitudes, essentially self-conscious beings don't have natures, they have histories. Or, put differently, it's their nature to have not just a past, but a history, a sequence of partially self-constituting self-transformations, mediated at every stage by their self-conceptions and culminating in them being what they currently are. Rehearsing such a historical narrative, what Hegel calls Erinnerung, is a distinctive way of understanding oneself as an essentially historical, because essentially self-conscious being. To be for oneself a historical being is to constitute oneself as in oneself a special kind of being, a self-consciously historical being. Making explicit to oneself this crucial structural aspect of the metaphysical kind of being one always implicitly has been as essentially self-conscious is itself a structural self-transformation, the achievement of a new kind of self-consciousness. And it's a self-transformation generically of this sort that Hegel aims to produce in us, his readers, by his phenomenology. Now, I suppose when it's sketched with these broad strokes, this is a reasonably familiar picture. Entitling oneself to talk this way requires doing a good bit of further work, however. Why should we think that there are things that answer to the definition I offered of essentially self-conscious beings? What is a self? What is it to have a self-conception? That is, to take oneself to be a self to or for oneself. For that matter, what is it for anything to be something for one? And how might the notion of a self-conception or anything else being essential to what one really is, to what one is in oneself, be cashed out or explained? Let me address the last question first. Suppose for the moment that we had at least an initial grasp on both the concept of a self and on what it is to have a self-conception, something one is for oneself. The story I've just told about essentially self-conscious beings indicates that in order to understand the relationship between selves and self-conceptions, we would need also to understand what it is for some features of a self-conception to be essential elements of oneself. That is, what one is in oneself, what one really is. A self-conception, after all, may include many accidental or contingent features, things that just happen to be taken to be true of the self in question. The notion of an essentially self-conscious being applies only if there also are some things that one takes to be true of oneself, such that one's self-conception having those features is essential to one's being the self that one is. How are those to be thought of as distinguished from the rest? Hegel's answer to this question, as I understand it, can be thought of as coming in stages. The first thought is that what it is for some features of one's self-conception to be essential is for one to take or treat them as essential. They're constituted as essential by the practical attitude one adopts towards them. The elements of one's self-conception that are essential to oneself, we may say, are those that one identifies with. Talking this way, essentially self-conscious beings are ones whose identity, their status as being what they are in themselves, depends in part on their attitudes of identification, their attitudes of identifying with some privileged elements of what they are for themselves. So we should ask, what is it that one must do in order properly to be understood as thereby identifying oneself with some, but perhaps not all, elements of one's self-conception? The answer we're given in the self-consciousness chapter is that one identifies with what one is willing to risk and, if need be, sacrifice for. Hegel's metonymic image for this point concerns the important case of making the initial transition from being merely a living organism belonging to the realm of nature to being a denizen of the realm of spirit. The key element in this index case is willingness to risk one's biological life in the service of a normative commitment, something that goes beyond a mere desire. Hegel says, it's only through staking one's life that freedom is won. Only thus is it proved that for self-consciousness, its essential being is not just being, not the immediate form in which it appears, not its submergence in the expanse of life, but rather that there is nothing present in it which could not be regarded as vanishing moments, that it is only pure being for self. By being willing to risk one's life for something, one makes it the case that the life one risks is not an essential element of the self one is thereby constituting, while that for which one risks it is. An extreme example is the classical Japanese samurai code of Bushido, which required ritual suicide under a daunting variety of circumstances. To be samurai was to identify oneself with the ideal normative code of conduct. In a situation requiring seppuku, either the biological organism or the samurai must be destroyed, for the existence of the one has become incompatible with the existence of the other. Failure to commit biological suicide in such a case would be the suicide of the samurai, who would be survived only by an animal. The animal had been a merely necessary condition of the existence of the samurai, like the presence of oxygen in the atmosphere, which is, to be sure, important to us, but with which we do not, just for that reason, count as identifying ourselves. No doubt, even sincere and committed samurai must have hoped that such situations would not arise. But when and if they did, failure to act appropriately, according to samurai normative practices, would make it the case that one had never been a samurai, but only an animal who sometimes aspired to be one. One would thereby demonstrate that one was not, in oneself, what one had taken oneself to be, what one was for oneself, namely a samurai. I called the sort of example Hegel uses to introduce this thought metonymic because I think that a part is being made to stand for the whole in this image. The point he's after is far broader than the example he gives. For identification in the general sense is a matter of being willing to risk and, if need be, sacrifice something one actually is in oneself for something one is merely for oneself, even if what is risked is not life, but only other commitments or entitlements. Hegel's arresting story of the struggle unto death offers a vivid image of one important dimension of the transition from nature to spirit. But once the realm of spirit, all of our normatively and conceptually articulated doings, is an up-and-running enterprise, most of what we have to lose, to risk, and to sacrifice is not a matter of biology, but of culture. What we at these subsequent stages in our development are in ourselves is in large part a matter of status, commitment, authority, responsibility. Rejecting something one already is because it collides with some commitment is identifying with the commitment one endorsed by sacrificing something else. The story about essentially self-conscious beings presupposes a conception of selves, and so of self-conceptions. What's a self? What is it to have a self-conception? That is, to take oneself to be a self to or for oneself. For that matter, what is it for anything to be something for someone? The first and most basic notion, I think, is practical classification. A creature can take or treat some particular as being of a general kind by responding to it in one repeatable way rather than another. In this sense, a chunk of iron classifies its environments as being of one of two kinds by rusting in some of them and not in others. Ubiquitous in the causal realm, every actual physical object exhibits this sort of behavior. And for that reason, this sort of behavioral classification is not by itself a promising candidate as a definition of concepts of semantic content or awareness. Pansemanticism, panpsychism would be an immediate non-appealing consequence. Hegel's alternative way is to look to the phenomenon of desire as structuring the lives of biological animals. A hungry animal treats something as food, he says, by, quote, falling to without further ado and eating it up, end of the quote. This is clearly a species of practical classification. The state of desiring, in this case hunger, induces a two-sorted classification of objects into those consumption of which would result in satisfying the desire and the rest. The constellation of hunger, eating, and food has structure beyond that in play in the inorganic case of the response of rusting and the stimulus of being wet, however. What ultimately drives the classification is the difference between hunger being satisfied and its not being satisfied. But the classification of objects by that difference is conditioned on a mediating performance, process, or response. What is classified is objects which, if responded to by eating, would satisfy the hunger, and those that do not have that complex property. Both the role played by the practical activity of the desirer, that is, what it does in response to the object, and the hypothetical dispositional character of the classification in terms of the effect that doing that on the satisfaction of the desire are important in Hegel's picture. What I'll call erotic awareness has a tripartite structure, epitomized by the relations between hunger, eating, and food. Hunger is a desire, a kind of practical attitude. It immediately impels hungry animals to respond to some objects by treating them as food, that is, by eating them. Food, accordingly, is a practical significance that objects can have to animals capable of hunger. It's something things can be for desiring animals. Eating is the activity of taking or treating something in practice as food. It's what one must do in order in practice to be attributing to it the desire relative or erotic practical significance of food. Eating is the activity that is instrumentally appropriate to the desire of hunger. It's subjectively appropriate in that it's the activity hungry animals are in fact impelled to by being in the desiring state of hunger. It's objectively appropriate in that it's an activity, a way of responding to environing objects, that often enough results in the satisfaction of the desire. This distinction between two sorts of instrumental propriety of activity to desire funds a distinction between appearance and reality for the objects responded to. It funds a distinction between what things are for the organism, the erotic significance they're taken to have, and what things are in themselves, the erotic significance they actually have. Anything the animal responds to by eating it is being taken or treated as food. But only things that actually relieve its hunger really are food. The possibility of these two coming apart is the organic basis for conceptual experience, which in its fully developed form is the collision of incompatible commitments. This account of the tripartite structure of erotic awareness offers a reasonably detailed answer to the question, what is it for things to be something for a creature? It's a story about a kind of proto-consciousness that's intelligible still in wholly naturalistic terms, and yet provides the basic practical elements out of which something recognizable as the sort of theoretical conceptual consciousness discussed in the first 3 chapters of the Phenomenology could perhaps be understood to develop. We know that Hegel subscribes to the Kantian claim that there can in principle be no consciousness, properly so described, without self-consciousness. So making the step from the erectic awareness of animal denizens of the realm of nature to the conceptual consciousness of knowers and agents who live and move and have their being in the normative realm of spirit, creatures who have achieved the status of normative selves or subjects, requires the advent of self-consciousness. And we need to understand what this achievement consists in and why genuine consciousness requires it. As we'll see, what's required to be able to take something to be a self is to be able to attribute attitudes that have distinctively normative significances. That is, we have to move from a world of desires to a world of commitments, authority, and responsibility. And the account of the tripartite structure of erectic awareness gives us a place to start in addressing this issue. We should apply the answer we have in hand to the question, what is it for things to be something for a creature, to the more specific case? What is it for selves to be something things can be for a creature? That is, what would be required for the erectic significance something had for a desiring animal to be not food or predator, but self or subject, in the sense of something things can be something for? And second, once we understand what it is to take or treat things as selves or subjects, what must one do to take oneself to be a thing of that kind, to take oneself to be a self? The philosophical challenge, then, is to see what sort of an account of self-consciousness one can produce by assembling these raw materials, that is, by applying the tripartite account of erectic awareness to itself. The interpretive challenge is to see to what extent one can, by doing that, explain the index features characteristic of Hegel's distinctive claims about the nature of self-consciousness. Two features of this approach are particularly worthy of attention in this regard, both of them features of his master concept of recognition, Anerkennung. First is Hegel's view that both self-conscious individual selves and the communities they inhabit are synthesized by reciprocal recognition among particular participants in the practices of such a recognitive community. Self-consciousness is essentially, and not just accidentally, a social achievement. Second, for Hegel, recognition is a normative attitude. To recognize someone is to take her to be the subject of normative statuses, that is, of commitments and entitlements, as capable of undertaking responsibility and exercising authority. This is what it means to say that as reciprocally recognized and recognizing, the creatures in question are geistisch, spiritual beings, and no longer merely natural ones. Here and on the handout are some of the familiar representative passages. Self-consciousness exists in and for itself when and by the fact that it so exists for another. That is, it exists only in being acknowledged. The detailed exposition of the notion of this spiritual unity and its duplication will present us with the process of recognition. Again, a self-consciousness exists for a self-consciousness. Only so is it in fact self-consciousness, for only in this way does the unity of itself and its otherness become explicit for it. A self-consciousness in being an object as just as much I as object. And with this, we already have before us the notion of spirit. What still lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousnesses, which in their opposition enjoy perfect freedom and independence, the I that is we and the we that is I. And again, but according to the notion of recognition, this, that is self-consciousness, certainty of itself, have truth, is possible only when each is for the other what the other is for it. Only when each in its own self, through its own action, and again through the action of the other, achieves this pure abstraction of being for self. End of the quote. I see two principal philosophical challenges that arise in understanding the discussion of recognition and self-consciousness in these passages. First, how are we to understand the transition from the discussion of the concept of desire to the discussion of the concept of recognition? This corresponds to the shift from consideration of particularly merely biological creatures impelled wholly by natural impulses in relation to their species, on the one hand, to consideration of genuinely social self-conscious individuals motivated by normative relations of authority and responsibility within their communities, on the other. How one understands the relation between these, both conceptually and historically, is evidently of the first importance in understanding what Hegel has to teach us about the normative realm he calls Geist. The second issue concerns the formal structure of his account of the synthesis of social substance by relations of reciprocal recognition. To recognize someone is to take or treat that individual in practice as a normative self, a knowing and acting subject, hence is subject to normative assessment as potentially committed, responsible, authoritative, and so on. The picture that's presented of this sort of community, within which fully adequate self-consciousness is achieved, is one in which recognition is an equivalence relation. Everyone in the community recognizes and is recognized by everyone else. He says, quote, each is for the other what the other is for it. And so recognizes everyone recognized by anyone else. Individuals are, roughly, particulars whose exhibition of, characterization by, or participation in universals is essential to them. In the case of self-conscious individuals, this means that the norms of the community they are members of are essential equally to the individual members and to the community as a whole. In such an ideal community, each member is to be able to recognize himself as a member. To say that is to say that recognition is reflexive. But recognition is also to be symmetric, that is to say reciprocal or mutual, Hegel's gegenseitig. The view appears to be that insofar as recognition is de facto not symmetric, it cannot be reflexive. I cannot be properly self-conscious, recognize myself, except in the context of a recognition structure that's reciprocal, that is, insofar as I'm recognized by those I recognize. This is the essence of Hegel's Wittgensteinian view of self-consciousness, which by contrast to a Cartesian view sees it as a social achievement, which accordingly takes place in important respects outside the self-conscious individual. It's not a kind of inner glow, it's a kind of social normative status. A big question on the formal side is then, why? Why should it be the case that reciprocal, that is symmetric recognition, is a necessary condition of reflexive recognition, that is, of self-consciousness, awareness of oneself as a self? Here's a thought about the shape of a possible answer. It's a formal fact that if a relation is both symmetric and transitive, then it's also reflexive, and hence is an equivalence relation. That is, if for any x and y, xry implies yrx, and for any x, y, and z, if xry and yrz, then xrz, then it follows that for all x, xrx. For we can just apply the transitivity condition to the symmetry pairs xry and yrx to yield xrx. So if recognition were for some reason de jure transitive, if it were part of the nature of recognition that one is committed to recognizing anyone recognized by someone one recognizes, then achieving de facto symmetry of recognition, being recognized by those one recognizes, would suffice for achieving de facto reflexivity of recognition, recognizing oneself. That is, each community member would recognize himself, and in that sense count as self-conscious, so long as everyone was recognized by everyone they recognize. That is, so long as recognition were reciprocal. So one way to forge the desired connection between social reciprocity of recognition and self-consciousness would be to establish that recognition must by its very nature be transitive. In what follows, we'll see how the tripartite account of erectic awareness can be used in a natural way to build a notion of recognition that satisfies these twin philosophical constraints on the interpretation of Hegel's notion of self-consciousness in terms of desire and recognition. Now, we can think of the tripartite structure of erectic awareness as consisting of three elements and three relations among them. The three elements are, first, an attitude, a desire, paradigmatically hunger; second, a responsive activity, paradigmatically eating; and third, a significance, food. And the three relations are, the attitude must motivate the activity in the sense of activating a more or less reliable disposition to respond differentially to objects. So hungry things have to be inclined to eat things. Second, responding to an object by engaging in the activity is taking or treating it in practice as having a significance defined by the attitude that motivates the activity. This is the subjective practical significance of the object. If you eat it, you're treating it as food. And third, the desiring attitude assesses the object, implicitly attributing to it an objective significance. Accordingly, as responding to it by engaging in the activity the attitude motivates does or does not satisfy the desire. If it does not, if what one ate didn't satisfy the hunger, if what the object was subjectively or for the animal does not coincide with what it is objectively or in itself, that is, if the activity was not successful in satisfying the motivating desire, then an error has been committed. What we're now interested in is a more complicated constellation of elements and relations in which the tripartite structure of erectic awareness enters twice. It is, of course, the structure of the whole thing. Hegel introduces his discussion by saying self-consciousness is desire. And I think this means, at least in the sense, that the most primitive form of awareness, including self-awareness, is to be understood as a development of the basic structure of erectic awareness. And we want to understand why it's also recognition, specifically reciprocal recognition. That is why self-consciousness takes that form. Within the tripartite structure of desire as it applies to self-consciousness, the significance attributed to an object, what it is for the organism exhibiting the erectic awareness in question, is to be erectically aware, to be something things can be something for. That is, the significance attributed by engaging in a responsive activity and assessed by the motivating attitude must itself exhibit the tripartite structure of erectic awareness. For one to have that significance for oneself, not just being in oneself something things can be something for, but being that for oneself as well, that significance must be something things can be or have for one. The tripartite structure of erectic awareness tells us that the two big questions that must be answered are these. First, what activity is it that institutes this significance, namely having the significance of having the tripartite structure? What is it one must do? How must one respond to something to count thereby as taking or treating it as exhibiting the tripartite structure of erectic awareness? What is to the tripartite structure as eating is to food? Second, what desire or other attitude is it that motivates that activity and assesses the success of taking something to have the erectic significance of having the tripartite structure of erectic awareness? That is, of being something things can be something for. What is to the tripartite structure as hunger is to food? To begin to address these questions and to indicate an important point of contact with Hegel's own vocabulary, we may call what I must do, the activity, whatever it is, that I must engage in order thereby to be taking or treating something in practice as something things can be something for, recognizing that creature. So far, this is just a label for an answer to the first question. Recognizing others is what we're going to call attributing to them the practical significance of exhibiting the tripartite structure of erectic awareness, that is, taking them to be takers, taking them to be subjects for whom things can have a practical significance relative to their desires mediated by their activities. What can we then say at this level of abstraction about the desire or attitude that is the third element completing the tripartite structure, whose attitude is recognizing and whose significance is attributing the tripartite structure of awareness. Hegel's answer is, I think, clear, if surprising. It's a desire for recognition. The desire that others take or treat one in practice as a taker, as something things can be something for, as an institutor of practical significances. If we bracket for the moment the crucial question of why a desire to be recognized is the attitude for which recognizing others is the appropriate activity, and so why it institutes the significance of being something things can be something for, making that something things can be for one a proto-conception of selves, we may ask what would happen if a being with that desire for recognition got what it wanted. If the desire for recognition is satisfied by responding to others by recognizing them, then according to the tripartite structure, the subjective significance the recognized ones have for the recognized desirer, the recognition desirer, shows up as being correct, as what they objectively are in themselves, namely subjects of significance instituting attitudes and activities. And what is required for that is just that one be recognized, for that's what it takes to satisfy the desire. One needs to be recognized by those one recognizes. For that, on the line of thought being considered, is what one must do in order, if all goes well, to satisfy the desire. So it follows from the claim that the desire that completes the higher order tripartite structure of erectic awareness, whose activity is recognition and whose instituted significance is exhibiting that tripartite structure, it follows from the claim that the desire in that higher order tripartite structure is a desire for recognition, that the recognition desire can be satisfied only by achieving reciprocal recognition. On this construal, then, having a practical proto-conception of selves, being able to take or treat things as subjects things can be something for, recognizing them, and being self-conscious in the sense of reciprocal recognition are two aspects of one achievement, two sides of one coin. In order to give a reading of these claims in terms of the tripartite structure of erectic awareness, the black box notion of recognition must be filled in so as to answer the following three questions. First, as to recognizing, what exactly is it that one must do in order to be recognizing someone? That is, what is the activity that I just labeled recognizing? Second, under the heading of being recognized, why should the desire to be taken or treated that way oneself, that is, to be recognized, be the one making appropriate that activity, namely recognizing? And third, under the heading of self-consciousness, why does the reciprocal recognition that results when that desire for recognition is satisfied by recognizing someone else amount to self-consciousness in the sense of applying a proto-conception of selves to oneself? The challenge is to give an answer to the first question about what recognizing is, what the activity is, that will entail plausible answers to the other two questions. The first point to make, I think, is that general recognition, taking someone to be something things can be something for, must be understood in terms of specific recognition. Taking someone to be something things can have a specific significance for, say being of kind K, say food, a predator, a potential sexual partner. One takes something to be a taker in general just in case there's some specific significances, values of K, for which one takes it that the individual is a K-taker, i.e. can take things to be Ks. So it will suffice to answer the questions above for specific recognition, relativized to some instituted significance K that things can have for a creature, in order to answer those questions for the more general case. Specifically recognizing someone as a K-taker requires one must attribute an activity that one takes to be what it is for the other to be responding to something as a K. Second, one must attribute a desire or other attitude that one takes to license or authorize responding to things as Ks, i.e. by engaging in that activity. And third, one must acknowledge in practice a distinction between correct and incorrect responses of that sort, assessed according to the attributed attitude that authorizes responses of that kind. My suggestion as to where we start is with the thought that in the most basic case, one can only take another to be a K-taker if one is oneself a K-taker. Taking the other to be a K-taker will then be attributing to him activity of the same sort in which one oneself engages in response to things one thereby takes to be Ks. That is, my taking you to be able to treat things as food is my taking it that you respond to some things with the same behavior, eating, with which I respond to food. With that clue, we're in a position to put in place the keystone piece of this explanatory structure. What the recognizing attributor responds differentially to as the success of a desire-authorized responsive activity is the cessation of that activity. Thus, no longer being disposed to respond to things by eating things indicates that hunger was satisfied. So the things previously responded to as food was in itself what it was for the one recognized as a desirer of food. So we can ask, what then is the differential response that's keyed to this difference in the one being recognized as a K-taker? And this is the decisive point. My taking your K response to have been authorized by a K desire that serves as a standard for the success of your K taking, and my taking that K response to have been correct or successful by that standard, is my acknowledging the authority of your K taking in the practical sense of being disposed myself to take as a K the thing you took to be a K. Taking it that the kind of fruit you ate really was food, in that it satisfied your hunger, is being disposed to eat that kind of fruit myself when and if I'm hungry. That is, when I have a desire of the same kind. This is a second-order disposition, involving a change in my first-order dispositions. My specific K-recognitive response to you is to acquire the disposition, if I have the K desire, then I will K-respond to the things to which I thereby take you to have successfully K-responded. My acknowledging your K desire as authoritative in the dual sense of licensing your responsive K activity and serving as a standard of normative assessment of its success or correctness just consists in my treating it as authorizing my own K takings, should I have a K desire. So in the first instance, my treating your K desire as having the normative significance of being authoritative for K takings is treating it as authoritative for them, full stop. Not just for your K takings, but for K takings generally, and so for mine in particular. The link by which the specifically recognized one's activity is assimilated to that of the recognizer is forged by the interpersonal character of the specific authority of the recognized one's successful takings, whose acknowledgement is what specific recognition consists in. The only way the recognizer's erectic classifications can be practically mapped onto those of the other so as to be intelligible as implicitly attributing specific desires, significances, and mediating responsive activities exhibiting the tripartite structure of erectic awareness is if the authority of the assessments of responsive significance attribution on the part of the one recognized is acknowledged in practice by the recognizer. So, specific recognition involves acknowledging another as having some authority concerning how things are. That is, what things are Ks. When I do that, I treat you as one of us, in a primitive normative sense of us. Those of us subject to the same norms, the same authority that's instituted by just such attitudes. Looking back at the most primitive sort of preconceptual recognition of others, from the vantage point of the fully developed, conceptually articulated kind, brings into relief the crucial boundary that's being crossed between the merely natural and the incipiently normative. In the merely erectically aware animal, desire is a state that motivates and regulates responsive activity immediately. It causally activates differential responsive dispositions to engage in activities, and its matter-of-factual satisfaction causes the creature to desist from or persist in them. But the recognizer, who's aware of the creature as being aware of things, does not feel that creature's desires, but only attributes them, implicitly and practically, by treating the creature as having them. The recognizer accordingly takes up a more distanced, mediated, abstract attitude towards those significance-generating attitudes. The recognized creature's attitudes are seen or treated in practice as assessing the correctness of practical responsive classifications, as licensing or authorizing the responsive activity. In the first instance, in the case of the one recognized, but then also on the part of the recognizer, who merely attributes the attitude to the other. The relation between the attitude the recognizer attributes and the activity he himself engages in is now a normative one. Even in the most primitive cases, it's intelligible as the acknowledgement of authority rather than mere acquiescence in an impulse. In treating the attitudes of the recognized other as having authority for those who do not feel them, the recognizer implicitly accords them a significance beyond that of mere desires, as normatively and not merely immediately significant attitudes. The story I've rehearsed about what happens when the tripartite structure of erectic awareness is applied to itself as significance shows how recognition develops out of and can be made intelligible in terms of desire. But it also shows why just being erectically aware is not enough to give one a conception of a self. That's something one can get only by recognizing others. For the possibility of treating attitudes as having a distinctively normative significance opens up in the first instance for the attitudes of others, for desires one attributes but does not oneself immediately feel. The claim I've been shaping up to understand is Hegel's central doctrine that self-consciousness consists in reciprocal recognition. And it should be clear at this point that recognizing others is necessary and sufficient to have a conception of selves or subjects of consciousness. But the relation between that fact and reciprocity of recognition, as what makes it possible for the participants to count as applying that concept to themselves in the way required for self-consciousness, has not yet been made out. To make it out, we can apply the observation made in the previous section that if recognition could be shown to be de jure transitive, then in any case in which it was also de facto symmetric or reciprocal would be one in which it was also de facto reflexive. For reflexivity follows from transitivity and symmetry. Simple recognition is not, in the relevant sense, transitive. For what I'm doing in taking another to be a subject of erectic awareness, namely simply recognizing that desirer as a desirer, is not what I take that desirer to be doing. The one simply recognized need not be capable of being in turn a simple recognizer, and so something with even a basic conception of selves. For that, we need to go up yet another level, and consider what it is to take another not just to be erectically aware, but to be aware of others as erectically aware. That is, we must consider what it is to recognize another as a simple recognizer, hence, as itself the kind of thing for which things can have a specifically normative significance. I'll call that practical attitude, just as a label, robust recognition. Robust recognition is a kind of simple recognition. It's simple recognition of something things can have a specified kind of erectic significance for, namely the significance of being something things can have erectic significances for. What's important for my story is that while simple recognition is not, robust recognition is transitive. And this is clear from the account I already offered of recognition in terms of acknowledging the authority of what things are for the recognized one. Recognizing someone as a recognizer is acknowledging the authority of their recognitions for one's own. That is, recognizing whoever they recognize. If one presses the details, there's some subtleties that arise, but when they've been carefully considered, the basic conclusion about the transitivity of robust recognition remains. So I'm going to suppress those details here. Since it is a kind of simple recognition, the activity element of the erectic structural triad characteristic of robust recognition, what one must do to be taking or treating someone as having the significance of a simple recognizer, is practically acknowledged as authoritative for one's own takings of the one being recognized, if they're successful and within the range of significance of one's simple recognition. In this case, doing that is acknowledging the authority of the recognized one's simple recognitions. Those simple recognitions are themselves a matter of acknowledging the authority of the ground-level erectic takings of the one simply recognized. So what the robust recognizer must do to be taking someone as a simple recognizer is to acknowledge as authoritative whatever ground-level takings the one robustly acknowledges as authoritative. And that's to say that the robust recognizer treats as transitive the inheritance of authority of ground-level takings that is what simple recognizing consists in. Now, it might seem that the hierarchy generated by acknowledging different levels of recognition is open-ended. Robust recognition is taking to be simply recognizing as a simple recognizer. Super robust recognition, say, would be simply recognizing as a robust recognizer. Super duper robust recognition would be simply recognizing as a super robust recognizer, and so on. Perhaps surprisingly, though, the crucial structural features of recognition don't change after we've reached robust recognition. The key point is that robust recognition is already a specific instance of simple recognition, that is, recognition of something as having a special kind of erectic awareness, namely awareness of something as erectically aware. As we've seen, that's a particular kind of erectic significance things can have. As a result of this fact, the nascent recognitional hierarchy would be reformulated as erectic awareness, simple recognition of something as erectically aware, simple recognition of something as simply recognizing, simple recognition of something as a simple recognizer of simple recognizers, and so on. But what one must do in order thereby to be simply recognizing someone, the activity corresponding to eating in the paradigmatic erectic desire activity significance triad of hunger and eating food, what one must do in order to be simply recognizing someone, the activity one must engage in to count as taking or treating an organism as having the significance of being erectically aware, is to acknowledge the normative authority for one's own responses of their takings of things as something. Taking something to be a simple recognizer is accordingly acknowledging in practice the authority of their takings of someone as an erectic taker, which is acknowledging the authority of their acknowledgings of authority. Whatever ground-level takings of things as something, the one being robustly recognized, takes to be authoritative, the robust recognizer thereby takes to be authoritative. So, in robustly recognizing you, I must simply recognize whoever you simply recognize. And the effect of that is to produce the transitive closure of the acknowledgement of the authority of ground-level takings in which simple recognition consists. Since robust recognition is the transitive closure of simple recognition, there's no difference between simple recognition of someone as a robust recognizer and robust recognition of someone as a robust recognizer. That is, simple recognition of someone as a simple recognizer. Robust recognition is transitive. For what one is doing to be robust recognizing, it must include commitment to robustly recognize whoever is robustly recognized by those one robustly recognizes. These are facts about the activity pole of the structure of simple and therefore robust recognition. What relates them is that the significance pole of robust recognition is the whole structure of simple recognition, just as the significance pole of simple recognition is the whole triadic structure of ground-level erectic awareness. Indeed, as we've seen that the significance pole of ground-level erectic awareness is the crucial element in the activity pole of simple recognition, and therefore robust recognition, for practical acknowledgement of the authority of the ground-level significances attributed in non-recognitional erectic awareness, is what the activity of simple recognizing consists in. If these are the relations between the activity and significance poles making up the triadic structure of recognitional awareness, what then about the attitude or desire pole? The story told so far lays it down both that the desire that motivates simple recognizing and so institutes its characteristic significance is a desire for simple recognition, and that the only erectic takings on the part of the one recognized that a simple recognizer is obliged to acknowledge as authoritative are those that the one recognized takes to be successful. So we should ask, which of the recognizings of a simple recognizer should a robust recognizer take to be successful? And the answer is only those that satisfy the relevant desire. That's a desire to be simply recognized, which is to say a desire to have the authority of a simple recognizer's takings acknowledged by another. But that's precisely what a robust recognizer does in simply recognizing anyone as a simple recognizer. So from the point of view of a robust recognizer, all the simple recognitions of the one robustly recognized count as successful and hence as authoritative. There is nothing that could count as taking someone to have a desire to be simply recognized, motivating that one's simple recognitions, which fails to be satisfied. And with this observation, we've reached, I think, our explanatory interpretive goal. For we wanted to know first how recognition should be understood to arise out of desire. Second, how normativity should be understood as an aspect of recognition. Third, how self-recognition, that is reflexive recognition relations, should be understood to require reciprocal recognition, that is to say, symmetric recognition relations. And fourth, how self-consciousness should be understood to consist in the self-recognition achieved by reciprocal recognition. The answer to the first question was supplied by seeing how the tripartite structure of erectic awareness could be applied to itself, so that what something was taken or treated in practice as was a desiring, significance-instituting creature. The answer to the second question was supplied by seeing how simple recognizing consists in the recognizer's achieving a mediated, distanced relation to the immediate felt impulse of the recognized one's desire in the form of its significance, conditional upon the recognizer's own desires for the recognizer's own practical awareness. In this way, the other's desire is practically acknowledged as authoritative, and the other's desire shows up for the recognizer in the shape of the recognizer's commitment or responsibility. The answer to the third question was supplied by showing how the social authority structure constitutive of robust recognition is essentially and in principle, hence unavoidably, transitive. For it's a basic algebraic fact that wherever a transitive relation happens to hold symmetrically, it's also reflexive. The argument that a relation's being de jure transitive and de facto symmetric suffices for it to be reflexive shows a certain kind of sociality to be sufficient for self-recognition. What shows it to be necessary is that I cannot practically distinguish impulse from authority in my own case. It remains only to put these answers together to supply a response to the fourth and final question. The connection between robust recognition and self-consciousness is as immediate as that between the tripartite structure of erectic awareness and consciousness. For to be a self, a subject, a consciousness, for Hegel as for Kant, is to be the subject of normative statuses, not just of desires, but of commitments. It's to be able to take a normative stand on things, to commit oneself, to undertake responsibilities, to exercise authority, to assess correctness. Recognition of any kind is taking or treating something as such a self or subject of normative statuses and attitudes. It's consciousness of something as having the normative significance of a self or subject. For recognition itself exhibits the tripartite structure of erectic awareness, that is, a proto-consciousness. The significance it accords to the one recognized is that of exhibiting that same structure. And adopting that practical attitude towards another is taking or treating its states as having normative significance, as authorizing and assessing performances. Not merely producing them, but making them appropriate. Eating on the part of the one recognized is now treated as something that involves a commitment as to how things are, a commitment that can be assessed by both recognized and recognizer as correct or incorrect. Self-consciousness then consists in applying this practical proto-conception of a self to oneself, recognizing not just others, but oneself. Having a self-conception, then, is a matter of the reflexive character of one's recognition, that among those one recognizes is oneself. The lowest grade of self-conception that exhibits these two dimensions would be simple recognition of oneself, being erectically aware of oneself as erectically aware of things. We might call that simple self-consciousness. But the two dimensions are much more tightly bound up with one another if one is aware of oneself as able simply to recognize things. In that case, the conception of selves that one applies to oneself is as something that has a conception of selves. And that we could call robust self-consciousness. I can now bring my story to a quick close. I started with the concept of essential elements of one's self-conception being ones that one identifies with, in the sense of being willing to risk or, if need be, sacrifice for them. One consequence of the transition from desire to commitment within the attitude component of the tripartite structure of erectic awareness is that where the activity-motivating character of desire is extinguished with its satisfaction, the activity-licensing character of commitment need not be. In particular, desire for recognition, in the form of a commitment to being recognized, is a standing structural element of self-consciousness. It persists even when fulfilled by the achievement of reciprocal recognition that is self-consciousness. Because it persists as part of the necessary background against which any other commitments are adopted and relinquished, being for oneself a recognizer is an essential element of one's self-conception. One's identification with it consists practically in the structural impossibility of relinquishing that commitment in favor of others. To be self-conscious is to be essentially self-conscious, to be for oneself and identify oneself with oneself as something that is for oneself a recognized and recognizing being. A further telling would continue with an account couched in the same basic terms of the specific distorted form of self-consciousness that construes itself under the distinctively modern alienated category of independence that Hegel epitomizes in the form of the master. It would explain how the self-conception characteristic of mastery arises from overgeneralizing from its capacity immediately to constitute itself as essentially self-conscious, to make it so just by taking it so, to yield an ultimately incoherent model of a self-consciousness all of whose conceptions are immediately constitutive, thus eluding quite generally the crucial distinction that consciousness involves between what things are for it and what they are in themselves. And it would explain what Hegel elsewhere calls die Wirkung des Schicksals, the metaphysical irony that undermines the master's existential commitment to possessing authority without correlative responsibility, to being recognized as authoritative without recognizing anyone as having the authority to do that. But that's a story for another occasion.